got some, I think you provided us with these graphs. We've got some graphs about that really tells a completely different story than we hear all the time in the media about global warming and storms and deaths from storms. You would think that the first hurricanes that ever occurred have been in the last 15 years. Right. Just not the case. And we've got this global number of deaths from meteorological disasters. And it goes through this chart from the 1900s to the 2010s. And of course, 1900s featured the Great Galveston hurricane of 1900, which killed maybe up to 10,000 people. And they completely rebuilt Galveston after that and raised the city 17 feet so that what happened then wouldn't happen again. And that's been fairly successful since Galveston hasn't been wiped out again so far. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the biggest decade for deaths from these kinds of disasters was the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. You got the 60s in there. We've had about the least amount of deaths. I mean, look at this chart. It's absolutely incredible.
Any death is horrible, but
yes,
for sure, with and more people. More people living in areas where the hurricanes strike.
Yes, more people in general and more people living along the coast.
Yeah.
So more people are endangered than ever before, yet fewer are dying. How do people respond when you share this with them?
Well, a lot of times, sometimes a lot of climate change skeptics, people that are on, as I say, people that are on Team Reality, a lot of them will post this graph as evidence that the climate's not getting worse. However, that's a little bit of a misrepresentation because these trends are a result of obviously better warning coordination and forecast lead times. Because Galveston, they predicted a sunny day that day, and they ended up getting wiped out by 8 to 12,000 people got killed by hurricane.
Yeah, they were pissed at their weather guy.
But what's remarkable about this chart, to your point that you made, is that, and it was an excellent point, is that the population has grown exponentially since the 1900s.
Right.
But the absolute number of deaths, even in spite of the population growth, have gone down by 96.2%.
Yeah, look at that.
Since the 1920s peak. And even those numbers are likely underestimated because extreme temperature data doesn't really go before the 1970s or 1980s. And then some of those hurricane data is sparse before the 1940s. So it's likely much higher than that even in the past, some of these numbers. But that's the data that we do have. And but climate alarmists, the people, a lot of them on the left, what they'll claim is that, the climate change is killing people, it's harming people, because that's what the climate crisis distinction revolves around, is how climate change is supposedly negatively impacting the state of human welfare. But there's not one measurable metric of human welfare. They could look at life expectancy, look at the crop yields. They're all at record highs. Number of deaths at all-time record lows. The share of the population malnourished is at record lows. The share of the population living in poverty is at record lows. So if climate change is having this negative impact, it's not at all evident in the data because we are innovative enough in our technologies to mitigate and adapt and overcome whatever challenges Mother Nature throws at us. And that's the important point about that chart, is that we are resilient. And there's no evidence that climate change is having a negative impact on society because we are innovative and we are adaptable.
Does this apply to tornadoes as well?
Yeah, actually, if you look at the number of tornado deaths in the United States, they've gone down significantly. Actually, have good data on that going back to, I think, the 1870s. And it's actually like all-time record lows. And just last year, or in 2022 or 2023, I can't remember which year off the top of my head, but nobody died from lightning for the first time ever, I think, in the United States. So it was all-time record low.
Wow. But what about intensity and frequency of tornadoes? Is there any evidence that that's increased?
Well, tornadoes, the interesting thing about tornadoes is that you would ideally rate tornadoes like hurricanes based on wind speed, but tornadoes are very, very small, compared to hurricanes. So we don't have a whole lot of data on wind speed going back very far. So it's not going to be particularly useful. But tornadoes, we do have tornadoes. Tornadoes are typically rated by damage according to the F or EF scale, the Fujita or enhanced Fujita scale. And that's largely based on damage that is incurred. So it was difficult to to tell about this is that back in the day, I'd say the 1950s and 1960s, tornadoes tend to be rated a little bit higher than they probably actually were based on the amount of damage. So you tended to see more strong to violent tornadoes, EF3, EF4, EF5, or in that case back then, F3, F4, F5, because it wasn't until the 2000s that they adjusted the scale a little bit. But and what's also interesting is that, also important to note rather, is that obviously there's more stuff to destroy now. So you kind of have to normalize it a little bit and look at, a damage maybe done to a barn or a forest to be able to kind of determine the intensity of a tornado. And where today it's a little bit easier because there's more buildings and stuff that probably get destroyed because they're in the path of these events. But if we look at just the actual number of strong to violent tornadoes, EF3, EF4, EF5 in the United States, which is where we have the most tornadoes in the world, so it's really only the data that matters. It's not really something that's a global. They happen everywhere, in a lot of different places, but the United States has the most by far. The number of strong to violent tornadoes are down 45 to 50% since real-time data collection began in 1954. But even if we assume that the older data is biased because it's rated higher in the 1950s and 60s, there has still been a decrease or slight decrease or no trend since the 1970s and 80s in the number of strong to violent tornadoes. The number of total tornadoes, say EF0, 1, 2, and 3, or especially EF0 and EF1, they've gone up a lot, but they kind of flatlined since 1990. So the reason for that is because the EF0s and EF1s are very weak and they're very easily missed because they're on the ground for a short period of time, and we have rural population expansion.
They still do damage.
Jeffy suffered through an EF0.
I did suffer through an EF0.
There's certainly, but they definitely are more easily missed in the historical record. So there was a rural population growth, and then about early 1990s, 1991, 92, there's been really no trend in any of the tornado counts, the weaker ones too, because that was when the NEXRAD WSR 88D radar came online, and we were able to detect these storms better. And everybody has a cell phone camera now, so you spot more. There's more reports, but not necessarily more tornadoes.